Thank you, Mr. Copeland. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank y'all for being here with us today. This is our second tax increase hearing. We will go through the same presentation that we did for you. I think it was last week. So, Mr. Chapman, you want to start us off? Mr. Harris, if you click on the presentation, go to slide 1, please.
Coweta County School System Board of Education intends to lower the millage rate for maintenance and operations to 15.41 mils. By levying the 15.41 mils, the Coweta County School System Board of Education will increase the property taxes it will levy this year by 9.52% over the rollback millage rate. Our total digest has grown from $7,321,077,347 to $8,689,288,565, or an increase of 18.69%. Each year, the Board of Tax Assessors is required to review the assessed value for property tax purposes of taxable property in the county. When the trend of prices on properties that have recently sold in the county indicate there's been an increase in the fair market value of any specific property, the Board of Tax Assessors is required by law to redetermine the value of such property and increase the assessment. This is called a reassessment. When the total digest of taxable property is prepared, Georgia law requires that a rollback millage rate must be computed that will produce the same total revenue on the current year's digest that last year's millage rate would have produced had no reassessments occurred. This calculation would require the school board roll back its millage rate from 16 mils to 14.08 mils. Since the school board has elected not to roll back its millage rate, they must advertise their intent to increase the property taxes it will levy this year by 9.52% over the rollback millage rate. Georgia law requires that 3 public hearings be held to allow the public an opportunity to express their opinion on the increase. This is the second of our 3 meetings.
So general fund revenues, you can see local taxes, the ad valorem taxes, almost 121 million for 44.77%. Other local sources, 16.7, which is about 6.19% of our general fund budget. State revenues, 131, almost 132 million for 48.86%. Federal, about 500,000 for 0.19, and then the total $270 million, just north of 270 million for 100% of our general fund budget. If you go to the next one for me, Mr. Harris, this is historic millage rate data for the county. I think we're going to go back to the early 80s, but if we were to go with this recommendation to 15.41, it would be the lowest millage rate since fiscal year 1983. That's 41-year low. Mike, if you would for me, click on the millage history document that's up there, and you can see, you go all the way back, to fiscal year 72, and you can see how the rate has fluctuated over the course of the history of the school system. We capture, I think, every year except for 2 or 3 years of the school system's history. I want to talk for a second about millage rate and assessed home value. Basically what we've done here, what Mr. Chapman's done, since he's much better at numbers than I ever will be, is he has calculated for us what school taxes would have been for a homeowner on their home last year at 16 mils and then this year at 15.41. Board members, you can see there the appraised value on the left. If you go all the way out to the right column, you will see what the amount of school taxes paid would be on a home if the value stayed the same. This is the point every year that I always like to remind you. The Board of Education does not assess or reassess home value. The only thing that the Board of Education is charged with under the state law is to set the millage rate, the rate at which the home or the property will be taxed on.
State law requires that we levy 5 mils of taxes to participate in state funding. As our digest grows, so does the amount that we're required to levy. With this increase of our digest, the amount our local fair share would increase this year is over $6 million. In the last 2 years, our local fair share will have increased over $14.4 million. So this factor is not taken into account in the rollback rate. It applies to everyone else except for school systems. No one else has to levy mills and reduce state income based on the digest.
And if I may, one thing I will mention there that Mr. Chapman just stated, that is the one thing that sets apart local boards of education and school systems. When you look at the figures that we're about to show you, And what the rollback rate would mean for us, if we went with the rollback rate, I think at 14.08, you're looking at being negative $11 million in the budget this year, because the local fair share, which is based off of the top number, the total digest, that's what it's based off of. So that 5 mills we have to levy in the last 2 years has gone up $14.4 million. Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Horton, could you, and it took me a couple of years, my 14th year serving on the Board of Education, it took me a few years to understand local fair share.
Yes, ma'am.
And I know a lot of people don't understand what that means, but we are required by law
Yes.
to help other school districts.
In order to participate in state QBE funding, which is the funding that the state provides for school systems, we are required to provide the equivalent of 5 mills, the levy of 5 mills into the pool for state funding. Some of that does go to other districts in the form of equalization across the state. Other portions of it actually go into the formula to be distributed for QBE funding. But that is what local fair share is. It's that 5 mil rate based off of that top number, which is $8.6 billion. So that's what they base it off of.
Do we anticipate that ever being reduced?
Well, the way the fair share is reduced is when the digest goes down. The overall digest goes down. As the digest continues to go up, the amount of local fair share theoretically would go up. And I haven't heard any conversation at the state level about requiring less than 5 mills, no.
With the prior year digest, 22, our fiscal year 23, $7.3 billion. We have true growth, reassessment growth, total growth just under $1.4 billion. The current digest, $8.7 billion. We budgeted collections right at $121 million. We were budgeted in the reserves for the general fund, $3.6 million. If we take those numbers, we started at our current millage rate, factor down by 1/4 point. We tried to find kind of a break-even point. The first column, amount budgeted, above amount budgeted in reserves. If we took the $3.6 million to balance our budget, we would have $11 million. Our projected increase in local fair share is just over $6 million. We would net $5 million. At the 15.41 mills that we've proposed, we net $33,000 over break even and covering our local fair share increase. If we went to the full rollback rate, we would be $11 million negative.
What we're trying to do at the 15.41 is get us to as close to revenue neutral as we can possibly be, okay? Get to a number that basically has us zeroed out budget-wise, where it's a revenue neutral number. So we're not losing money, we're not making money on this particular mill rate, if it makes sense. One of the things that as we've gone through this process, and Mr. Chapman and I have had conversations about it along with Mr. Latimer, you know, one of the things that I think is important, we absolutely have to live up to our responsibilities to our students and to our employees and to this community. The other piece of that is, though, is to try our best to be responsive to the community and to the homeowners and property owners in this community. So, you know, I think it's important to make sure that this recommendation gets us to what we need, but not anymore. And this is as revenue neutral as we can possibly be with that local fair share that we're obligated to pay to the state. Go to the next one. I mentioned earlier that the 15.41 would be the lowest millage rate in Coweta County for education in 41 years. These are last year's rates for surrounding counties. You can see next door in Fayette, they were at 19.15, Carroll 17.5, Troop 17.3, Spalding 16.7, Henry 20, Fulton 17.24. Over to the next side, you can see the only one that I can find in the metro area or locally would be Heard County at 14.454. So in addition to being the lowest recommended rate in 41 years, it's also one of the lowest ones in the metro area. That helps us to be competitive. Again, I go back to what I said earlier, philosophically, do what we need to do to be able to operate the system and live up to our responsibilities to our students and to our community. But also, it helps us remain a very attractive place for people to want to live and to do business because that rate's one of the lowest around. So I think that's an important component as well. Some final comments. One thing I'll mention is that third bullet right there. If you approve this rate this evening, it'll be the fourth year in a row that the millage rate has been decreased, and it's a decrease of 17.1% over that 4-year period in the millage rate. You may recall that as home values stayed pretty stagnant in the early to mid-2000s, the rate stayed the same. As home values have gone up, the rate comes down. However, that local fair share continues to increase for us. I call this the bank balance report. Mr. Latimer has a better term for it. It's the reserve fund equity analysis. But if you'll look, I've made the statement to you before that we use our operating reserve to run the system between July and the end of the year, December, when taxes begin to roll in. Take a look at what fund balance does, the yellow column, from July through October. If you look at July of 2022, about this time last year, 27 million fund balance. It went down the next month to 17. The end of the month, next month, 7 million. And then look at October of 2022. We ended the month with 1.291 million, 1.3 almost million of fund equity. If you look at the right column, in parentheses is the negative number. That's the amount of fund equity that we had used to operate. And at the end of that month, we were at 1.3 million. If you'll scroll on down a little bit, Mr. Harris, the reason I mention this, if you look at our payroll and benefits, 91% of our budget, give or take, is payroll for employees. Our monthly payroll is 21 million. The reason I bring that to you, we always try to keep a healthy reserve in case something comes up. We also use that to run the system for basically 6 months until taxes come in. We were down to about a day's worth of operating funds until the tax money came in. What that helps us to avoid is it helps us to avoid having to go out and take out what's called a tax anticipatory note, where we go and borrow money from the bank in order to meet payroll for a month or 2 months or however long it is at 21 million, almost 22 million, and paying the interest on that money. So I think that's an important thing to note because I know that the reserve sometimes is prominently mentioned. Those funds are used in order to run the system and also to be prepared for anything unanticipated that might come up. Board members, we'll be happy to take any questions you have. Yes, sir.
As low as that got to possibly having to borrow money, does this new millage rate we're tentatively looking at, are we going to be okay through October this time with that millage rate?
Yes, sir. That's one of the things that, of course, we talk about in our internal discussions. Mr. Chapman and Mr. Latimer feel good that we will be able to operate without having to go and borrow money to make payroll. And as long as they still feel good, I feel good. Yes, sir. Any other questions? All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's all we have.